acting president for TeenProLifers. I'm so excited to have you joining us. Today I'm going to be joined by Owen Miller, who is the Director of Internal Communications with TeenProLifers, and we're going to be discussing the most recent Texas ban, what it means for the pro-life movement, what are some of the possible outcomes of this, and what impact is this having. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Owen. And Owen, could you please introduce yourself, what you do at TeenProLifers, and what got you involved in the pro-life movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. This is actually my first time doing one of these live streams for a group, so that's exciting. So I'm Owen Miller, and right now I serve as Internal Communications Director at TeenProLifers. So I manage all the little internal workings of our group. I take care of all the little gears in the clock, if you will. I first got involved with the pro-life movement probably freshman year of high school. I was just surrounded by a very like-minded group of people, very progressive, and I just realized at a certain point that I didn't want to be the same as everybody else, and I kind of fell into my own, realizing what I wanted to do when it came to the whole issue surrounding politics and the pro-life movement.
Absolutely. And Owen, obviously this Texas ban it's big for the pro-life movement. Can you talk a little bit about why is this ban a little bit different from the past heartbeat bills that we've seen? Can you kind of give us the rundown?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, heartbeat bills have definitely kind of come into their own since the early 2000s. That's been pretty much the primary past like 20-year period when they've really been hitting hard on trying to pass that sort of legislation. And ordinarily, those sorts of things will get struck down by the Supreme Court, circuit courts, or pretty much anybody willing to take a stand against pro-life legislation. And historically, there's been major problems with legislation that aims to kind of fight against abortion. And historically, it has not gone too well for states that try to do it on their local levels. Individual cities who want to become like pro-life sanctuaries have had trouble in the past because that's not a new thing either. But Texas, the case is very different. And the biggest thing people are talking about, at least over the past few days regarding the Texas bill, was specifically the fact that on a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court chose not to pass an injunction and to temporarily put a halt on the law until they could actually make a formal decision about its constitutionality. And a big part about that is because not only is the Texas law new, it's also something that is completely unique in its approach as to how exactly it deals with fighting against abortion. And I was actually reading an article about this today. And the number one thing that allows the Texas law to be so incredibly different is the simple fact that it's not the government that's actively trying to fight against abortion, but rather it's left much more in the hands of the people. And the big part about that is that the government will not be prosecuting individuals for getting an abortion. And that's a big part of the bill. And that's actually something Felipe and I were going to talk about a bit later on this stream. But the whole idea of civilians bringing along civil suits targeting people who assisted in the abortion is something completely revolutionary in the approach to dealing with pro-life legislation. And it's really an approach that's never been tried before on a state level. This is the largest instance of this sort of unique perspective that we've ever seen. There have been really tiny instances of like individual towns doing something similar in the past, but those are rare and far between. I think it's pretty safe to say that the new Texas law is very experimental in its approach. And so far, from what we here at TPL are able to tell, it's probably going to be extremely viable in terms of its constitutionality and how it actually aims to assist women at the same time while fighting against abortion.
Absolutely, Owen, and I think you covered that perfectly. And I like that you touched on how this law is a little bit different from the rest in the sense that this is actually enforced by the people and not state government. So in the past, the legal strategy for heartbeat bills has been for the attorney general or the governor to enforce this, to have lawsuits, and obviously it would be a violation of precedent, which would be Roe v. Wade. So what this novel legal strategy said and did was, we're going to just have the people enforce it, because by doing that, then Planned Parenthood and the abortion lobby, they can't sue all of us, right? They can't sue over 1 million people. So this created this big conundrum where Planned Parenthood was freaking out. They were saying, we can't sue. Like, who do we sue? We can't sue the attorney general. We can't sue the governor. We can't sue the state because they're not enforcing the state. It's the private citizens that are doing this. So I honestly think that it's honestly a brilliant strategy from Texas legislators. And I also wanted to just jump into some of the big myths that Owen touched on a little bit. So Owen, we've heard a lot of misinformation from the abortion movement. They're in a panic frenzy, and they're just resorting to lies, to deception. And I've seen a lot of misinformation on social media. I know we've heard people saying that women are going to be punished, that the rapist of a woman can sue the woman who wants to get an abortion. So obviously there's a lot of misinformation. So can you touch on a few of them, Owen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of the biggest caveat I've had dealing with this whole situation, because I think that is what it is. I mean, this is really something that's revolutionary. This year and over probably the next 9, 12 months is going to be really huge for deciding the future of abortion in America, especially regarding the Mississippi case, and especially now in the past few weeks regarding Texas. And I think the biggest thing on misinformation is that at a certain point, you can have that sort of a civil dialogue with the other side. That's what I want to encourage. I know that's what we're actively encouraging at TPL. But at a certain point, spreading lies and slander about the opposing side is absolutely not what we want to do. And I would hold that to the pro-life movement as well, because I would never want my group in my political niche to be actively spreading lies and misinformation about the other side, because I want to have that civil dialogue. But what we've seen over the past few days, especially regarding some groups specifically, is just blatant misinformation surrounding the Texas law. And Felipe, you touched on it briefly, but the biggest thing there is that women are not punished for receiving abortions under this law. The penalties are there, but it's in the context of actually going after those who assist in the abortion. And absolutely the biggest thing that you also touched on, Felipe, was that post that we actually talked about on the TeenProLifers Instagram. Make sure to give us a follow. But yeah, so the biggest thing there were several posts that actually went viral regarding the whole idea that a father can rape his daughter and then sue her for $10,000. That's not how the law works. I mean, I want to really stress, and Felipe, I know you'll agree with me, that this legislation really is brilliant in its approach to dealing with abortion, because we're not aiming to just criminalize abortion, we're aiming to help mothers as well. And with this legislation, there's been so much misinformation spread about what happens, who gets punished, who gets prosecuted, that I think a lot of it has just gotten lost in the noise. And I can't fault everybody who liked any given post talking about something that wasn't true. But what I can say is that right now there's huge division between the pro-choice and pro-life sides of this, because obviously the pro-life movement has made a major victory here. And of course that's going to upset our opposition. But in the end, it's just really disappointing to see this sort of dialogue resort down to completely false, baseless claims, to the point where we have to rectify the situation. And like we did with TPL, issuing a special little graphic response of our own, talking about how these sorts of accusations regarding what happens to people who actually receive abortions or try to circumvent the law is blatantly false. And it's, to be honest, been very frustrating to have to deal with that misinformation. I know that that attitude is definitely kind of concurrent among a lot of the other pro-life people I've talked to. Like, we are trying to fight for what we believe in. We want to have that sort of a civil dialogue, and it's just becoming increasingly harder in today's polarized day and age.
Absolutely, and I really like how you phrase that. And I think I heard about a poll recently that came out from, and they're definitely not a pro-life organization, but they essentially a polling firm came out with a poll, and 46% of Americans are actually on board with the Texas ban, in comparison to 43% in opposition. So I think that within itself speaks volumes, because in the past, we've slowly made a lot of progress, and usually people would be very much opposed to banning first or abortions in the first trimester. So I think we've really, really made a lot of progress, and I think the Texas ban reflects that. So yeah. I think I mean, what this poll essentially says is that just being pro-life, it's trending right now, and I think we're on the winning side. And I wanted to touch on, you brought up the fact that women are not going to be prosecuted. And I've seen a lot of this on social media. And I think it's so particularly interesting because it's not just social media accounts, it's also the press and news outlets that have been going with this story that if a woman gets raped, that the rapist can legally sue her. That is not the case. And as Owen mentioned, it is explicitly mentioned in the language of the bill. There is a clause that says that the rapist, or what, the rapist, sexual assault, they cannot sue the woman who wants to get an abortion. So for CNN, for a lot of major news outlets to be going with this, I think it's concerning because, one, it shows that they haven't done proper research. They're just going in and, well, if everyone is saying this, then it must be true. And I think that's the biggest thing right now. If you're having a lot of people saying one thing, then you're going to say, well, it must be true because it's on social media, or it must be true because it's on TV. So I just want to remind everyone, just because you see something on the internet does not equate to it being truth. So yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up was I've heard a lot of eugenicist arguments lately in which people are saying, oh, Texas is going to be overrun with an epidemic of kids who are not wanted, who have disabilities like Down syndrome. That is an incredibly privileged statement for people to make. You are here because your parents chose life. You are here because your mom had the courage to say, even if my child comes out with a disability, they are my child. So for people to be sitting in a place of commodity, and whether it be their couch or their bed, and just saying, woman has a right to choose an abortion if their baby is going to have a disability. I think that's incredibly, it's the definition of eugenics. So Owen, can you touch on a little bit about how would you address that? Because again, we have so many people saying that the state is just going to be overrun with unwanted kids. Are kids really unwanted?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of that whole thing we're seeing regarding people talking about children being born with a low quality of life, it really kind of grinds my gears. When it comes down to it, and actually, I'm going to reference back to Felipe. I know this is a tweet we were actually talking about. I think it was yesterday or the day before. But you can have your opinions on the quality of life of an individual, and I will wholeheartedly disagree at any time. But there was one particular tweet that we noticed, and it was talking about how much of a shame it is, apparently, that some people are going to get the right to life that didn't have access to that before. Because obviously we know the statistics when it comes to abortion regarding Down syndrome, autism, those sorts of things. And the way the tweet had phrased it was just so incredibly vulgar. And it's just so hard to understand coming from that sort of standpoint. Because when it comes down to it, I'm happy that this law has been passed, and I'm glad that we're actively fighting for life. And it can just be so incredibly disheartening to see that there are some people out there who genuinely believe that there's no dialogue to be had. And kind of on that, they don't want to have a dialogue about an issue as controversial as blatant eugenics. And, I keep saying it over and over again, but I'm always willing to have that sort of a disagreement with somebody, no matter where we stand politically. But at a certain point, I draw a line about what I consider to be an okay political opinion and about what I consider to be borderline eugenics. And I really think a lot of people, especially those on social media and especially a few people in the news, have really shown their true colors regarding the whole issue. And it really is a shame to see because, again, you want to have that dialogue. You want to have people be able to work together regarding these sorts of issues because you want the most equitable outcome for everybody, including the preborn. And when it comes down to it, there are some people that are just completely unwilling to have that sort of a compromise. And it's really just so heartbreaking to see that that's where we've come to in today's day and age. Because before, it used to be that you could have those political disagreements, and in the end, you could walk away happy, knowing that you at least had some sort of a civil dialogue. But today, even in our comment section of our Instagram page, we see people treating us like garbage, not because of the people we are, but rather because of the political beliefs we hold. And TeenProLifers has taken a very active stance on this regarding cyberbullying. It's happened to some of our members, and it's absolutely not okay. And in the end, it's just so frustrating to be in this current day and age where one group is looked down upon for making progress rather than the other group simply trying to kind of revert back on that. And I want America and the world as a whole to be in a place where we don't have to worry about that sort of a thing. But there are some fringe extremists out there trying to justify their political beliefs And kind of going back to that Rasmussen poll you were talking about, Felipe, of course, this is a very, very divided issue, but it's very, very problematic when these sorts of extremists who are endorsing literal eugenics try to insert their political views into this debate and paint them as mainstream. Because let's be real, the vast majority of the pro-choice movement is not in favor of what they would consider to be blatant eugenics. When it comes down to it, that is a very, very small subsect of that movement. And of course, it's a lot of people, but percentage-wise, it's not as much as it could be. And it's just extremely problematic that in today's day and age, that's where we are. We see that in the end, these sorts of fringe extremists are inserting themselves into both sides of the political spectrum and both sides of the political debate. And it's making it harder for all the people that are just trying to improve America and the world and to fight for or against abortion to have that sort of a civil dialogue.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to mention that a lot of people have also been saying that we're just abandoning women, that we are, pro-birth. And it has been an argument that we have heard time and time again, that we don't care about women after they have their baby, that we don't care about the baby after they, after the baby is born. That couldn't be any further from the truth. And I've seen, again, so many people who are saying this, but at the same time, they fail to acknowledge that the bill has allocated $100 million to help women in these situations. It's not Planned Parenthood that is helping women. It's not the abortion industry that is helping women. It is the pro-life movement. It is the state of Texas who is committed to defending life. Now, these $100 million are basically going to pregnancy resource centers that are going to help women with life-affirming resources that don't include abortion. And I also wanted to touch on the fact that there are tens of thousands of federally qualified health centers that are inspected regularly. They follow all state and federal mandates and protocols. And they actually have more resources and more services than Planned Parenthood. The only difference is they don't offer abortion. And these federally qualified health centers have been funded by the government, and women, thousands of women, millions of women go here every year. So no, we don't need Planned Parenthood. People act as if reversing Roe v. Wade, as if getting rid of abortion in this country is going to go back to this archaic medieval times in which women, like this Handmaid's Tale story. Not at all. Quite the opposite. We're progressing towards a society that actually views human life as valuable. And I think over the past, 40 something years of having legal abortion in this country, human life has become more and, increasingly more disposable, less valuable. We don't really see human life as, the gift that it is. So yeah, I think that this law in Texas is a step in the right direction. I also wanted to, ask you, and I know there's been a lot of reporting on this, but there's word that some states might be copying the Texas law and following in the footsteps of Texas. What are some of these states, and what can we expect to come from this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I did want to say something on that. Kind of going back to that idea of the millions of dollars that have been allocated by Texas to support women. And we obviously do see these new states, there's around half a dozen, that are interested in implementing legislation that is, for all intents and purposes, basically an exact copy of what Texas is doing, just more applicable to that state. So when I hear news like that, and whenever I read those articles, I feel really great, because I don't just see states that are willing to fight against abortion. I also see states that are willing to support women with legislation, who are willing to allocate millions of dollars to help improve the lives of women. And it's really great to see that sort of an energy in local, state level politics. And it's really just kind of a weight off my shoulders to know that there are actively state legislatures out there fighting against abortion. A couple of the most notable states include Florida, who I know has actually talked about considering a very, very similar piece of legislation to Texas. There's one Florida state senator, I believe, who's actually taking heat on that, and they're hoping that they can actually get that legislation inserted into the 2022 docket. I know both of the Dakotas have had some serious rumors, and of course, Kristi Noem in South Dakota is going to be a huge fighting force, especially with the executive order she just signed regarding chemical abortions in the mail. I know Idaho is also a big state that is heavily considering that. I believe a state representative in their state house is taking heat on their specific case. And even in Kansas, where nobody's openly said anything, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there are most definitely murmurs about what's going to happen regarding legislation for pro-life stuff in Kansas. Because even from my sort of local perspective, Republicans are very confident that they will be able to put in a pro-life candidate, likely Derek Schmidt. And it's very interesting to get that sort of a local, state level perspective, knowing that with Republican supermajorities and a decent chance at a Republican governor coming up for our next gubernatorial election, that Kansas is likely going to be taking some serious strides towards fighting against abortion. And I am confident that if that is the case, which I sincerely hope it will be, that we'll even be implementing something very similar to Texas. Because here in Kansas, we have very, very, very few abortion clinics. I think the number is less than half a dozen. And we have also, admittedly, very few crisis pregnancy centers and other centers that are aimed at supporting women. So those sorts of funds that are being allocated by Texas would also work in other states. And coming from that local perspective, that is absolutely what you love to see. And of course, the citizens of these other states where we see these sorts of legislation happening, like South Dakota, Idaho, Florida, I'm confident that the pro-life movement is going to be really emboldened there because, to be perfectly honest, it's been a while since the pro-life movement has had some serious wins. And over the past 2 or 3 years, we've been getting non-stop victories, admittedly tiny ones, but it's been a very, very good few years for the pro-life movement. And as it looks right now, that trend is probably likely to continue.
Absolutely. And I think part of the reason that this has been trending so much is because the pro-life movement is just so diverse. And that's what I personally love so much about being a part of this movement is you don't have to be a Republican, you don't have to be a Democrat, you don't have to be young, you don't have to be old to be pro-life. It's simple. I mean, the pro-life perspective is abortion is morally and ethically wrong. It's wrong to kill an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion should not be legal. It's really not a controversial topic. Well, obviously it is in society, but amongst different people within the pro-life movement, we all have that agreement, that consensus that human life is valuable and it's worthy of protection. I wanted to touch on the Supreme Court case that's coming up. So Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Center, they're expecting to have oral arguments around the end of fall, maybe early winter. So it'll be around November. And essentially what this Supreme Court case it's from Mississippi. So Mississippi put in a law a few years back that said, okay, we want the right to ban abortion pre-viability. Now, historically, Roe v. Wade has allowed states to ban abortion / restrict abortion in the third trimester. But Roe v. Wade is very clear that states cannot limit abortion in the first trimester. So this is a big deal. I mean, it's a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade. In other words, if the Supreme Court, which I mean, I'm pretty optimistic that the conservative majority will vote in the favor of Mississippi. If the Supreme Court was to vote in the favor of Mississippi, basically it would contradict Roe v. Wade, and it would say, okay, now states have the right to ban abortion before viability. So this would immediately cause Roe v. Wade to just completely collapse. And as Owen mentioned, over the past few decades, the pro-life movement has slowly but surely been chipping away and eroding Roe versus Wade. And I think we're finally we're at this climax. We're at this point where it's game time. All of the work of 20 plus, decades and decades of hard work from multiple pro-life generations is finally going to pay off. And, just to be alive during a time like this where, we can say that we are doing something to end abortion, I think it truly means a lot. And it goes back to the point of when we look back on abortion in 10 or even 50 years, I think we're going to look at Roe v. Wade and what we did in this country in shock. And we're going to say, were we on the right side of history or were we on the side that was actively advocating for the murder of billions of people on this earth. So yeah, and then the other thing I wanted to bring up. So Planned Parenthood has been, emailing this. They've been putting this phrase in their press releases, and I think it's funny. It's true, but it's funny because at the same time, this is what we want. So Planned Parenthood has been saying that the Texas ban will disproportionately impact people of color. This is true. I mean, more than 80% of Planned Parenthoods are in minority communities, and just a few years back, New York was having more black babies aborted than they were being born, and people might say, well, it is kind of strange. But most people don't really know the past eugenicist history of Planned Parenthood and who that founder was. So, Owen, can you kind of enlighten us all as to who Margaret Sanger was, why Planned Parenthood is racist, and why, this Texas ban is going to actually help minority communities?
Yeah. This actually brings up a really interesting story for me. One of my teachers, I won't say who, but history, and she teaches our AP US history class, and it was very interesting because very, very intelligent woman, and we disagree, sorry, on pretty much everything when it comes to politics. But last year, it was actually really fascinating because we were actually getting into Margaret Sanger, and we pretty much ignored the whole issue surrounding Planned Parenthood, and basically we spent probably 2 days talking specifically about birth control and other forms of like very, very basic level sex education. And we didn't talk about the Planned Parenthood aspect at all. And this wasn't like a caveat of my teacher ignoring it, but more so that the book we were reading through just kind of skimmed over the fact and basically ignored the racist history behind it. So we actually ended up turning one of those days into really a constructive dialogue talking about the racist history of Planned Parenthood. And it's interesting coming from the perspective of a pro-life person, because I've spoken to pro-choice people and I've even heard stories regarding what happens internally with Planned Parenthood regarding their blatantly racist history. And I've heard two different approaches that Planned Parenthood basically deals with it. The first of which is just pretty much to deny, and to not acknowledge what's basically fact. And the fact is that Margaret said there's not much else to it other than that. You have a few caveats about different people who tried to dissuade Planned Parenthood from going down that route, but other than that, the history and the basis on which Planned Parenthood is founded is racist. And Planned Parenthood to this day actively tries to deny that in some instances. But in other instances, active members that are supporting Planned Parenthood and other pro-abortion organizations actually kind of own up to that. And I do have respect for people who are willing to do that, because the kind of second option that I've seen among individuals who are willing to acknowledge Planned Parenthood's racist past but still support it has been simply to kind of move on. And while I understand that sort of perspective that you're coming from, it's really kind of problematic to see that there are some people who are willing to acknowledge that past but still endorse Planned Parenthood. So I think when it comes down to it, one of the biggest things is that as of right now, Planned Parenthood, of course, is posing major problems when it comes to the whole issue surrounding Texas, Mississippi. Their lawsuits are absolutely everywhere, and the pro-life movement is right now being emboldened. But the reality of the situation is, I think a lot of people are waking up to the history of Planned Parenthood. I think the pro-life movement is actually becoming pretty mainstream among Gen Z. And I think in the end, the next few years of the pro-life movement will probably be defined by Planned Parenthood finally kind of being dethroned from their position at the very top of the pyramid when it comes to any and all debates surrounding abortion, whether that be pro-life or pro-choice, because they've almost for the past few decades had a functional monopoly regarding education, dialogue, argumentation, and that's been extremely unhealthy for the civil debate. And I do blame Planned Parenthood for a large portion of the polarization we see in today's day and age, because I think obviously abortion is probably one of the most contentious issues that exists, period. And I don't think it's helping that some people are pretty much just choosing to willingly try to like stir up the pot and try to continue with that sort of rhetoric that isn't productive for any sort of conversation about policy, about rhetoric, or about morals.
Absolutely. And two things. I wanted to first address a comment that we received, and I think they bring up an excellent point. So essentially, Marshall said it's a fallacy to care about the intents or life of the founder for something as being important to an argument. If the person who made toilet paper was racist, that has no implications. Now, that would be a good point. The problem is if the founder who made toilet paper, if their goal was to, let's say, kill certain people of color who use their toilet paper, right? They can die, but their company keeps going and they're selling that same toilet paper. It's the same concept in abortion. Margaret Sanger was very clear, speaking numerous times at KKK rallies, that she wanted to reduce the African American population. It wasn't a secret. She was very open about it, and she basically said that her way of getting to that goal was using Planned Parenthood as a vehicle. And
Mhm.
essentially, you have a good point. Yes, Margaret Sanger is dead, but her legacy of racist abortion continues today. And again, going back to my point of New York City, or actually New York State, they were having more abortions than black babies were being born. That's a very, very concerning thing. And once again, 80% of Planned Parenthoods are located in minority neighborhoods. So you have a point that Margaret Sanger is dead. We acknowledge that, but her legacy, her mission of reducing the African American population, it's still very much present today. And as Owen mentioned, I do give a lot of credit to people in the pro-abortion movement who are able to own up to that and say, you know what? Yeah, we had a really racist founder who spoke at the KKK, and her goal was to reduce the African American population. But again, it's still continuing today. It would be a completely different story if Planned Parenthood wasn't doing abortions. And yeah, Owen, I also wanted to touch on the fact that oftentimes uh, a lot of people will say, but abortion is only 3% of what Planned Parenthood does. They have all these great resources. They do, STD screenings. They do mammograms. They give prenatal care. And hint, hint, prenatal care and mammograms. Cecile Richards has consistently said that they do provide that, but when people have called the Planned Parenthoods across the United States, they deny that they provide any prenatal care or mammograms. So, Owen, what's really going on? And I mean, Owen, again, if Planned Parenthood, if abortion is only 3% of their business, why are they so worried? Why are they investing so much time, so much resources, so much money into a service that isn't? It's hardly 3%. Why is
Yeah, absolutely. I think in an objective sense, everybody seems to agree on the fact, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, that providing women with services to help them get through a pregnancy, if they choose to keep the baby, is an obviously great route to go. We need to funnel resources into those sorts of programs. And I think the kind of caveat I have with it is that when people talk about Planned Parenthood supposedly going out of business or being blatantly attacked by legislation because supposedly it's only 3% of their services, well, why are you worried about that specifically for the reason of business if it only makes up such a small portion? Now, I understand if you firmly believe that people should have a right to an abortion and you're concerned primarily about actual access to abortion. From there, I can understand where somebody's perspective comes from. But what I'm seeing a lot of lately is that people acknowledge on the pro-choice side that those sorts of arguments don't seem to work when they're arguing with pro-life people because they know they're probably not going to change a pro-lifer's mind. So instead, they resort to the idea of business. But at the same time, that argument doesn't really seem to hold because, again, coming back to that idea that Planned Parenthood only has about supposedly 3% of their services being abortion. And if not, that obviously comes to the problem that Planned Parenthood is extremely manipulative when it comes to their statistics on what sorts of services they provide. I was actually watching a video about this probably a year or two ago. It's been a while at this point. But kind of the thesis of what the video was talking about was basically that Planned Parenthood considers a lot of things a service. They actually went so far as to say that in the experience of some women who had gone to Planned Parenthoods not for abortions, they count almost everything they do there as a service. In fact, I think part of the video discussed how they actually have a specific guidebook, a specific subset of rules regarding what actually counts as a service. And I believe that's actually accessible on the internet if you look hard enough for it. And basically, it's a lot of things, including physically handing an object to a patient can count as a service depending on what that object is. Additional things include supposed like services they provide that they claim actually happen, but they don't really perform those on a national level. And then in claiming they provide those services, they're able to, in an admittedly somewhat honest way, conflate the fact that they provide those services as actually doing those services and performing them. Like Felipe, you gave the example of mammograms. And I think Planned Parenthood, if they're good at anything, they're very, very good at stretching the sort of idea of what they provide. And I will give them credit because they are fantastic at being manipulative when it comes to those sorts of numbers. And I'll admit a lot of businesses do that, but when you have such a politically charged issue as abortion and something so incredibly immoral, obviously it takes on an extremely different and extremely heinous sort of context. And I think we've been seeing this probably for decades, probably longer than anybody was even realizing it. Because when you think Planned Parenthood, you don't think those services, you think abortion. When it comes down to it, I think the biggest thing is that crisis pregnancy centers are obviously what you think of when you think of trying to provide those services for women. But Planned Parenthood has a completely different connotation. And I think the reason behind that is because people universally try to acknowledge that Planned Parenthood is an abortion provider first and foremost. And I think even a large portion of the pro-choice movement pretty much acknowledges that in a sense, because I think it's become extremely problematic that, like I was saying earlier, people are having to shift the arguments they use when they're arguing in the comment sections of Instagram posts, because at that point they know that they're not changing any minds or winning any arguments, and it's basically completely shifted the narrative away. And I think kind of deep down, everybody's well aware of the fact that, first and foremost, Planned Parenthood provides abortion, and pretty much anything else isn't really a consideration when we're talking about what they do.
Right. And I think it's so important to mention that Planned Parenthood, although they say that it's only 3% of their services, which, and I like that you mentioned, they grab all of the services that they offer and then they just divide, and that's how they get 3%. Now, when we're talking about the budgetary, the financial income from abortion, it's very, very substantial. And I was looking here, and usually the average abortion for the first trimester, it can range from a couple of $100s to about $1,500, and I find it so bizarre that Planned Parenthood claims to care so much about women that they're charging them thousands of dollars to kill their baby. And let's see. The estimated abortion revenue from Planned Parenthood is about $190 million, according to Live Action. And this was a few years back, so I'm sure it's grown a lot. But yeah, that's nearly $200 million. You can call it 3% of your services, but it's a huge chunk of your yearly income as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I find it so ironic. Right. I find it so ironic that Planned Parenthood claims that they are nonprofit, which they are, but at the same time, it's just a tax exempt status, right? But their executives are filling their pockets. Go ahead, Owen.
I think a big part of that is there, in context, are times where you need to look at the percentage of something, and there are times where you need to look at the hard numbers. Because let's pretend that the 3% statistic was actually accurate for a second. That still means abortion is, in terms of quantity, a huge thing when it comes to what Planned Parenthood does. And if Planned Parenthood really did have 97% of their resources and services dedicated to supporting women, that would be great. And I would still be extremely disheartened at the fact that 3% of those were abortion. But the reality is the situation has become so muddled by Planned Parenthood that it's hard to discern what's truth from what's fiction. And I'm extremely proud that the pro-life movement has actually done a really great job when it comes to those sorts of issues, because I think overall independent groups, fact checkers, and news outlets have been able to discern what's clearly lies about Planned Parenthood and what's clearly true. And I think the truth is that Planned Parenthood is not looking out for women. They're not trying to advocate for them, and they're actively working against them and utilizing their sorrow and what's going on in their lives in terms of them desiring an abortion as a way to make money. Planned Parenthood is probably the most for-profit nonprofit I've ever seen.
Right, absolutely. And again, going back to the whole point of we're a nonprofit, we care about women. And it's a talking point that I hear a lot from abortion supporters. They'll say, oh, but Planned Parenthood is just a 501c3. I understand that, but have you seen the salaries of the executives from Planned Parenthood? So yeah, and I just want to touch on another thing. I mean, these people are essentially filling their pockets from women who are paying them to like legally kill their children. Uh, I mean, that's basically Planned Parenthood. They're not shy about it, and I find it so bizarre and so ironic that whenever you go on their basically their social media or their website, it says in their website, describes the procedure. It says, "Oh, we use gentle suctioning." They use all of these different terms to make the women feel like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just like getting a tonsil removed or your wisdom teeth removed. That's a talking point I've heard a lot from NARAL and Planned Parenthood. So yeah, I mean, when you have a big industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry that is profiting off of women in, honestly, I dare to say, one of the most difficult times of their life, rather than providing them with the resources that they need to actually choose life and to actually, keep their children, they just say, oh, give us $1,500, we'll solve all your problems. And that's not the case. I mean, we have seen so many women over the past 40 something years that are now beginning to speak out, and they're beginning to say, you know what, abortion hurt me, and I still think about it today. So yeah. And another thing I really wanted to touch on was how ironic Roe v. Wade came to be. It was built on deception. It was built on lies. And if you haven't seen the movie Roe v. Wade, which I think was from Nick Leob, I recommend that you watch it. But yeah, I mean, essentially, Norma McCorvey, she used to work at Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood was just itching to legalize abortion. So they just grabbed one of their employees who was honestly going through a very difficult time. I think I'm not sure if she was an alcoholic, but they just kind of grabbed her and they said, "You're going to do this for us." So she did. And they went to the Supreme Court, said that she had been raped. I believe that was the context of the case. But long story short, she never even had the abortion, and a few years after that, she converted to the pro-life movement. So I think it's so ironic that we're in this point in time in which we are actively condoning violence against women. We are actively condoning violence against the preborn. We're in 2021. We're supposed to be a progressive society, but then we turn a blind eye to, millions upon billions of lives lost to abortion. So, yeah. And then let's see. I also wanted to just jump quickly into some of the dynamic. And I think I've been tracking this for the past few days, Owen. I think it's so interesting, but Texas Right to Life set up a reporting system where, again, citizens from Texas, well, actually anywhere in the United States, can basically put in a tip in the website that says, this facility just did an illegal abortion at 10 weeks pregnancy, right? That's obviously illegal under the Texas law. But what I've seen is that so many big corporations, so many people have been pressuring Texas Right to Life and saying that what they are doing is wrong, that it's an invasion of their privacy, of HIPAA. Owen, I mean, how do you respond to this? And is Texas Right to Life doing the right thing? I certainly think they are. And yeah, like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a big part of this kind of has to do with hypocrisy. When it comes down to it, Texas Pro-Life has been doing fantastic in handling the entire situation. The amount of professionalism that we've seen coming from that group is really quite astounding in the face of all the attacks they've been getting. So, quick round of applause for them for everything they've been doing and how they've been handling the situation. And yeah, I do think their approach they're taking is probably the best one. When it comes down to it, look at how the pro-life movement has been fighting against abortion. I mean, there are some extremists out there who probably want to bomb abortion clinics, to be perfectly honest. But the mainstream pro-life movement would never do that. We would never do that because we are about being for life. And I think when it comes down to it, the approach we've taken since Roe was established has been non-confrontational in the sense of violence. And we've always focused on taking legislative action to fight against abortion. We've had immense respect for the law, even though in our view, we've literally seen hundreds of thousands upon millions of babies be slaughtered before they even had the chance to exit the womb. And even in such dire straits, even with such morally abhorrent consequences, the pro-life movement unilaterally has been united in the sense that we will always have respect for law and we will always take a legal approach towards getting abortion out of the United States and the world as a whole. But what we're seeing now is that there are people that are actively advocating against for what Texas for Life is doing, despite the fact that Texas for Life is only propping up and supporting what is now functionally law. And you really hate to see it because the pro-choice movement has been shielded by Roe for the past 5 decades. And I think that sort of legalistic consequence has basically generated that sort of attitude in the pro-abortion movement that they don't need the same respect for law that the pro-life movement has had. And I really think Texas is going to serve a very important lesson for the pro-abortion movement as a whole, because I think it's going to finally be a situation where the pro-life movement has such a major victory that they are put in, admittedly, a very minute situation where they are finally forced to work within the confines of the law, where they need to acknowledge that if they truly want to advocate for what they believe in, they need to take a legalistic approach instead of just having to deal with the status quo and protect it like they have been for the past 5 decades.
Right, absolutely, and I think you phrased that perfectly. But yeah, I mean, we have had decades of this going on, and I think people are just finally saying, we're sick of this. Abortion is inherently anti-women. And then I did want to bring up, while we're on the topic of the Texas Right to Life reporting system, they've been sending out press releases that they have been having a very difficult time because there have been hacking attempts. There have been fake websites that have been created to troll pro-life people who are attempting to report something. Yeah, I mean, GoDaddy, who is actually the host for TeenProLifers, they basically kicked out Texas Right to Life's website, prolifewhistleblower.com, and they said you're in violation of, blah, 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 blah policies because of privacy. I can give you at least, off the top of my head, there are so many different examples that don't relate to abortion and are active reporting systems. Mm-hmm. So I think this is honestly a blatant abuse and honestly just it's bias from GoDaddy. I think they were getting a lot of pressure to kind of just do away with Texas Right to Life's website. So yeah, and then the other thing that I've come across these past few days is there's been a lot of fake websites, and they look legitimate until you see all of the language within the website. It'll be saying cuss words. It'll be saying, F you pro-lifers. And Owen, I really like that you brought up how the pro-life movement over the past 40 something years has taken a very pacifistic approach to how we go about abolishing abortion. Obviously, I think it's the right thing, because if you look at past civil rights movements, like the civil rights movements for African American rights, they were nonviolent for the most part, right? But yeah, I mean, you don't get anything with violence. Quite the opposite. I think it reflects poorly on a movement, and it is counterproductive. So yeah, I really like that you brought that up. We are a pacifistic movement, and I think a lot of the violence that we're seeing, especially in this time, 2021, has been from the pro-abortion movement. I've seen a lot of vulgar language, a lot of people be assaulted just for being pro-life. Um, and yeah, I think we're just reaching a point in which the abortion movement is beginning to hit that panic button. They're beginning to, really, really worry about what the next 5 or 10 years might even look like. So yeah, and then I think we're gonna just quickly wrap this up with a kind of bringing the Texas law and also the Supreme Court case Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Center, and just kind of I guess bringing them together and asking ourselves, how is this benefiting the pro-life movement? And Owen, I wanted to get your thoughts on the Supreme Court case. Can you super quickly run through what would a victory for the pro-life movement mean in the Supreme Court? Would Roe v. Wade be reversed? Would abortion be completely abolished in the United States, or is this like the first step for the pro-life movement?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think the perspective on what's going to happen with Dobbs is really, really fascinating because for all intents and purposes, it is not a full reversal of Roe. I think it could become that potentially, but I think another outcome is more likely. And I think that outcome is that functionally it will directly contradict and go against what Roe establishes. And it'll basically open up a clause for individual states to pretty much regulate abortion how they see fit, at least bare minimum to the par Mississippi is engaged with, obviously, because that's where the case is originating from, if not further, because I'm confident that the Supreme Court would more than likely, in the most probable situation, probably phrase the majority opinion, if it were to pass, that they firmly believe that any sort of ban prior to viability is constitutional regarding whatever form of decision they take in whatever form of constitutional interpretation that is, and that extends beyond Mississippi. So for all intents and purposes, this is a functional attack on Roe v. Wade that almost systematically dismantles it, because obviously Roe is very complicated in the sort of precedented sense. And obviously the attacks that we've had on in the past trying to dismantle it on an individual state level have had to be very, very slow and very, very gradual, because Roe is very meticulous in how it's phrased, and it's also very meticulous in the fact that it promises a lot to the pro-abortion movement. And so far, the pro-life movement has been making strides, constitutionally speaking, against it. And I think that the outlook for Dobbs to probably be ruled in favor of Mississippi is looking very, very, very good. And I say this all the time, and I'll go ahead and say it on here, but Roberts is probably one of the best Supreme Court Chief Justices that there's been in a very long time. And I say that with a little sort of footnote that he is obviously not the most conservative person when it comes to abortion. He's taken a public stance against it, and we know that there's a decent chance he votes in favor of Mississippi, but there's also a tiny chance he doesn't. And I think a big part about that is that Roberts has done a fantastic job of leading the court, but even with the case regarding Texas and their injunction, we saw that Roberts actually sided with the liberal majority, who are traditionally very, very pro in favor of abortion. So I think that the court is probably going to be somewhat divided, but in the end, I think Roberts is probably going to set a very strong precedent regardless of who he sides with. And I think that the chances of the pro-life movement coming out on top with Dobbs are very, very, very strong. And I think looking forward, that we're probably going to see some major victories for the pro-life movement because of that. Because right now, like we talked about, the movement is emboldened. And I think Dobbs is probably going to be the final sort of brick in the wall that really allows for the pro-life movement to finally realize once and for all that we are in the ultimate position to finally abolish abortion, no matter how we go about that, whether that be state by state, on a federal level, or anything.
Right, absolutely, and I just want to touch on Roberts. So historically, and I mean, I think Roberts has flip flopped on a lot of past Supreme Court cases. He's supposed to be pro life, but sometimes he's flip flopped, whether it be on precedent. But I agree with you, Owen. I'm crossing my fingers that he does the right thing this time and that he actually votes in support of the Mississippi law. But only time will tell, and I'm very confident. I agree with you that the outcomes of this are looking very good. We're very optimistic. So we'll see what happens then. But yeah, just wrapping this up, once again, the Texas law is still in effect. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to allow the law to remain. And part of the reason I think it was allowed to remain was because of the upcoming Dobbs case. So the Supreme Court is sort of saying, let's put this on hold for a little bit. We're pretty confident that we're gonna vote in favor of Mississippi. So only time will tell, but we're very hopeful that other states like Florida, Tennessee will follow in the steps of Texas, and that we'll see more lives being saved. And one last thing I wanted to mention was the Texas law has been saving roughly between 130 to 150 lives per day. So if you're on the fence about this law, just keep that in mind. A heartbeat, it's a human heartbeat. We shouldn't be killing innocent human beings. So, alrighty. Well, I appreciate you hopping on with me today, tonight, Owen, and we'll see what comes out of this Supreme Court case and the Texas law. So, but thank you so much
Yeah,
for joining me.
absolutely. Thank you, Felipe, and thanks for having me.
Of course.